a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I talk to folks who say they don't read, and I wonder what kind of an alternate universe are these people living in? Then I run into folks who don't drink coffee, and I wonder what's wrong with them. Had Noah been able to get his hands on coffee, the ark would have been twice as big, and he'd have built it in half the time. Had Moses had coffee, he wouldn't have wandered around the desert for so long. Coffee helps us get things done, and the best coffee gets the best things done. Julio has organic beans roasted in the back room, ready for your taste buds extravaganza. 4501 McPherson, home of the best coffee in the universe. Walk right in. It's around the back. Just a half a mile from the... No, wait a minute. That was Alice's restaurant. Organic Man Coffee Trike, or if it's too far, organicmancoffeetrike.shop. We're trying to set up that guest event in Fall Festival in Houston, Georgia. If you think you might be able to attend, if you could contact me, either just put a thing in the comments or send me an email at strangethings@arkanasa.com. We're trying to get a rough guesstimate as to whether a lot of people will show up or just 2. If you think you might be able to attend or you just would like to attend, let me know and we'll put you on the numbers. Dave sent me another idea for a show. I've had some really good ideas in the past. Shows that I thought would go viral or at least get a few good comments. The audience didn't seem that impressed. I've also done a few shows that I thought were less than my best efforts, only to see the numbers go up really weird. I get all kinds of comments on the shows that I didn't think were that good, and people loved them. I'm still wondering what's going on in Vietnam. They're uh, they're beating everybody else in the numbers right now, and it's kind of got me worried. Anyway, if I were Lionel Fanthorpe, I could read the phone book and people would love it. But I'm not. I have no idea what makes a good show. I just keep plugging away and see what happens. I put a show together, I record it, and then I see how y'all think of it. Maybe a computer in Vietnam got stuck. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. Anyway, getting back to Dave, he had suggested doing a show about some of the things that we used to do on midnights. Not necessarily intelligent things, but at the time they seemed like good ideas. As far as I know, nobody ever went to the hospital or jail as a result of them, but it did add to the evenings. Most folks who work tend to get home at around the evening time and they spend a little time with their family or their pets, and then they go to bed and get some sleep. This is considered a normal routine. The only folks awake after midnight are either doing a job that requires around the clock coverage, like the hospitals, nuclear power plants, soldiers, law enforcement, things like that, or the folks that are out looking to do bad things. Darkness is their best ally in some situations. Patrol, we had this nasty thing called doubling back. We would get off work at 4 p.m. supposedly. We never got off at 4. It was usually 5 or 5:30. We would rush home, eat dinner, and try to go to bed and get a little sleep. So we could then get up at 11 o'clock p.m. and go back to work. No matter how hard you tried, you could not force yourself to go to sleep. You would lay there and think about how good it would be if you could sleep while at the same time you weren't. It seemed like you'd fall asleep just about a half hour before the alarm went off. The first night usually wasn't too bad. You needed a lot of strong coffee and something to listen to, such as Art Bell. We didn't have him for the first couple of years that I was in Laredo. The second night was always the worst. You couldn't get any sleep once you got off of that first midnight. If you're lucky, maybe 2 or 3 hours in a 48-hour period. As soon as things got quiet, the Z Monster would attack. At our station, we had to drive down to Sector and then pick up a vehicle so we could drive. Let me try that again. At our station, we had to drive to Sector in order to man the cameras. On a good night, maybe 2 or 3 of them would be working. The second night after doubling back was a killer. It was sitting at the desk, sound asleep in the morning, when an assistant chief walked in right behind me, and he said, "Are you going to call out that traffic under the bridge?" Coming out of a dead sleep and not thinking, I said, "I've already called them out. There's some agents waiting for them." He said I was doing a good job and he left, not knowing that I'd been in dreamland probably for the last 20 minutes. That answer had simply popped into my head unannounced. It must have been some of that good old Army training. One guy, we called him the Worm, had his head down on the desk when the same assistant chief walked in. The chief said something, and the Worm shot straight up with a bunch of papers stuck to the side of his face with saliva. Let's just say his supervisor got a call. Scan Base was more of a curse than an assignment. You had to drive down south and pick up a 10 muster, and then pick up a unit, and then drive back north to Sector. I would drive right past my house when doing this. Once at Sector, you had to drive around the parking lot looking for some place to park. Laredo North shared the parking lot with Sector, and it was very limited in parking. The Sector crew all had reserved parking, but the Untermensch, we had to look for some place to leave our vehicles. Add to the mess, the person who designed the parking lot didn't allow for drainage. So when it would rain, we would have a 6-inch deep lake that we had to wade through to get in and out of our vehicles. I always wondered why it was that people who were always put in charge of construction projects had never worked in construction. One night, as I sat there watching the 3 cameras that were working, the camera tech came in to fix the control box. Why he was working midnights, I have no idea. What he needed was some C4, but instead what he used was crazy glue. And yes, he glued his hand to the box. He tried pulling the box loose. Well, that didn't do any good. So he pulled out a knife and he tried cutting through the glue. Instead, he wound up cutting his hand. He left a trail of blood out the door to the bathroom. The control box was now completely useless. It was covered with glue, which had gotten inside and screwed up all the controls, and it was covered with red stuff that was slowly turning brown. Now, none of the cameras were working, so I called the supervisor and I said, could I go work the line instead? But he said, no, I had to stay there at scan base, even though scan base wasn't working. Good thing I brought a book. I always carry a book in case something like that had happened. I also always carried my lunch because I didn't trust the people at the restaurants. Always carry a book when you're working shift work. We used to do things in order to stay awake, things like getting out and walking the river. Nowadays, I doubt that agents do this. I guess it's gotten too dangerous or something. But we would walk around and we'd check the old landings to see if anybody was using them, and we would look for new landings. We would walk sometimes for many miles. The last thing you wanted to do was sit down with your back against a tree. You would probably wind up falling asleep. We were working this one area midnights. There were three of us together, kind of stretched out, keeping an eye on the trails and the landings. And, well, I guess I must have kind of dozed off just a little bit. I shot awake as a group of aliens came walking almost on top of me, carrying duffel bags full of dope. We all jumped to our feet, trying to act as if we hadn't been asleep. Everybody was out. We yelled and waved our arms, and the aliens all ran back into Mexico. We wound up with about 400 pounds of marijuana. It happened. Nobody can possibly say that they never fell asleep on the job. The trick was to just not get too deeply unconscious. You would kind of be there with one eye open, which, if you've never done it, you won't understand it. We had a checkpoint out in Oilton. It was a POS Airstream trailer with bullet holes in it. We called this place home once in a while. It had sketchy electricity. You turn the light switch on, and sometimes the lights would come on, and sometimes not. There was no heat, none at all, and no bathroom. There was a porta potty out behind the trailer. The backup team had encountered a rattlesnake out on a ranch, and the rattlesnake lost. The agents, knowing who was on the checkpoint at that time, brought the snake to the point. Let's just call the guy in the vehicle Dick. That wasn't his name, but that's what he was. So Dick is sitting there in the unit. He's sound asleep. So these two agents, they coiled up the rattlesnake right by the driver's door, and then they jumped in their unit and they drove up to the point as if they were civilians needing inspection. They honked the horn. Well, Agent Dick shot up out of his slumber and tried to act like he wasn't unconscious, opened the door, and stepped right on the snake. He screamed. He jumped sideways back into the unit, coming to rest on his partner's lap. up against the passenger door. He was trying to draw his pistol, but, well, that wasn't happening. There were lots of bad words said. Uh, Plans were made to hatch revenge, but I don't know if it ever happened. It was hilarious for those of us that weren't involved. As a trainee, we had to go to class during the day and then double back to midnights to work our normal shifts. I was working midnights at the checkpoint, and the Z Monster had snuck up on me. I had thought it would be a good idea to sit in a chair at primary. I awoke to the smell of coffee. I looked, and here is my supervisor, Pete, holding a cup of coffee under my nose. Well, I shot awake. Instead of getting mad, Pete said, "Oh no, Pard, you look tired. I think you need this coffee. Why don't you just stay right there and drink some? I'll check primary." Well, that was Pete. He was something else. He was a cowboy before joining the Border Patrol. I never saw him get mad, and I don't know. He was just a good guy to work with. We had a few that you didn't want to be around, but Pete was a good guy. There were those who pretended as if they had never done anything wrong at work. They would get all kinds of mad at the new guys and treat them like subhumans. We had one that convinced the trainees that they had to buy his lunch. I always treated my trainees well. I tried to teach them to do the job and how to have a little bit of fun at the same time. You never knew what these folks were going to do in their careers. The first year in Laredo, we were all trying to stay on the supervisor's good side while at the same time learning to do our jobs. Thanksgiving was approaching, and one of our agents invited the entire shift to his house for turkey. It was midnight, but the plan was that we were going to eat dinner and then everybody go home and try to get a couple hours of sleep and then back to work. Well, I was having dinner with my girlfriend's family, who then became my wife. So I told Don I wouldn't be able to make it. Just about the entire shift did. His wife apparently didn't cook the bird enough. I rolled into the office and I sat there waiting for the supervisor to hold muster so we could get out and do our jobs. The phone rang. One of the guys said he was feeling really bad and he wasn't going to make it in. As soon as he hung up, the phone rang again. Another agent calling in sick, followed by another and another. The soup was getting really mad because the shift was rapidly shrinking. Me, being me, I said, "Man, I should have called in sick too." Ooh, I was sitting right there in front of him. He turned purple. Not a good look. This was not Pete. He started saying things about how agents were being unreliable and this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, dude, I'm here already. By the time the shift started, there were only four of us, including him. I really did not want to be in town that night because, well, a lot of times we worked with the supervisors. Fortunately, I got lucky and I was sent out to the checkpoint with Nick. We didn't have a backup, so we were told to just watch traffic and pull over anything that looked suspicious. Nick had been our firearms instructor at the academy. Once it, he was he was the man as far as learning because he liked to teach. He would stand at the checkpoint if the checkpoint was open, and he would tell you to stand right next to him and watch. Don't say anything. Car would pull up, he'd inspect the occupants, and he would tell the car to go away. And then he'd say, okay, now you do it. So you'd stand there, car would pull up, he'd stand there and watch, but he wouldn't say anything. You do what you do, the car would pull away, and then Nick would tell you if you made any mistakes or if you did a good job. He would say, next time, try this or try that. He was good to work with. Learned a lot from that man. Well, we drove out to Oilton and we sat there watching cars go by, and once in a while we stopped somebody who looked a bit suspicious. You don't just stop cars because you want to, you have to have a reason. A lot of agents have gotten in trouble for thinking they could just stop anybody because they wanted to. A little something to do with the Fourth Amendment. At around 4 o'clock, Nick told me that I could just sit back and relax and catch a few. In other words, take a quick nap. He was going to stay awake and keep an eye on things. Then, after a few minutes, he would take a nap while I kept an eye on things. Well, I was well into the dreamland when I was startled awake by Nick suddenly yelling out and hitting the steering wheel with his fist. I looked around thinking I must have missed something. No, it turned out that Nick had fallen asleep as well. We're both sitting there, unconscious, on the side of the road for several hours. Oopsies. He, he said this was not a good thing to do, but don't tell anybody. Well, it's been 37 years, so I'm sure we're good. When working with a partner, you always wanted to make sure that at least one person was awake. Didn't always work that way, but that was the plan. If you drove on midnight, you had a good chance of staying awake. Hopefully. If you were shotgun, you would probably make it out the driveway before falling asleep. Some agents didn't even pretend. They would say something like, hey, don't drive on any bumpy roads, and then they'd curl up and crash. This was always considered a challenge. One of the best things to do was to drive into the railroad yard and find a section of track with a good curve in it. You'd park right where the train would be coming straight at you and then wait. You'd wait until the train was coming along with the big headlight shining right in the windshield. Then you'd scream and open your door and jump out. Your partner would usually also scream. They would try and jump out the door, discovering that their seatbelt was still on. They would make all kinds of frantic movements, and you'd usually laugh until something hurt. Another unpleasant thing to do was if you knew that the agent you were working with was a city boy, you'd drive, as they sat there asleep, way out into the middle of nowhere, some deserted ranch where it was pitch black. And then you'd sit there and you wait a couple of seconds and then scream your head off and yell, what is that? And point out their window. A lot of times they would scream and do all kinds of crazy things, wondering what it was that you saw. One day, Sector decided they were going to be nice to us, and they bought an actual big trailer, which had actually been slated for Hebronville, but somehow we wound up getting it instead. It had a heater and air conditioning and electricity that worked. It also had bathrooms and some really comfy chairs for people to sit in. One midnight, I was on primary, and I noticed the guys in the trailer were all asleep, backup and my partner. They were all unconscious, which got me to thinking something really bad I could do. I carefully locked the door so they wouldn't be able to get out. Then I walked out into the middle of the road. I was going to lay on the ground, fire my pistol into the air several times, and then just lay there. They would come running to the door, discover it was locked, probably break the door down trying to get out. Then I got to thinking. If they were to call Sector and say that I'd been shot and then ask for backup in an ambulance, I would probably have to go speak to the chief in the morning. Fortunately for me, I decided that was not a good idea and I didn't do it. I was actually laying on the ground when I decided maybe I shouldn't. When I got to Laredo, there were only 3 radio stations to listen to. 2 of them played what we called teenage rock, which I hated. And then we had one AM station that played country, a KLAR. Uh, they sat right next to the river, about a half a mile from our station. Once in a while, we would swing by in the middle of the night and talk to the DJs. For those of you that don't know, a disc jockey would actually sit in the radio station playing records. They would make comments about the songs, they would tell us the local weather and the news every half hour. KLAR had this one female disc jockey from England. How and why she wound up in Laredo, well, that's a whole other story. She would drink a little bit at night, and sometimes she would drink quite a lot, and her words would begin to get somewhat slurred and sloppy. Whenever this happened, somebody would key their mic, and in their best Scooby Doo voice, they would say, "Ruh-roh," and everybody knew what they were talking about. A song would come on, and then at the end of the song, there would be a different disc jockey talking. Apparently, they had sent her home or had somebody come pick her up. One day, the station announced they were changing their format. They were not going to play country music anymore. Instead, they were going to do talk radio. Well, this was greeted with a whole bunch of cursing and swearing because a lot of us liked country. Oh, this is why I always use a metal coffee cup. For those of you not looking on YouTube, I'm holding my Art Bell coffee cup, or what's left of it. Not the one that Dave sent me, but the original one. Anyway, the station was changing to talk radio, and we didn't much care for it until we discovered that we were now going to have Art Bell on the radio from midnight to 5 a.m. every night, including weekends. All of a sudden, midnights weren't quite so bad. The bad news was if you had to actually do your job, you'd miss parts of the show. There was no computer site at the time where you could log in and listen to the parts of the show you missed. If you wanted to, you could send a check to an address and they would mail you a cassette of the show that you could listen to, but none of our units had cassette players. We had AM FM radios if we were lucky. Some units, all they had was a hole in the dashboard where the radio should have been. Those of us that planned for these eventualities, we carried small AM FM radios in our bags just in case. In case we had a listening emergency. The folks in charge were constantly trying to come up with new and exciting ways to make our lives worse. We had to qualify every 3 months. I enjoyed going to the range, getting a little gun practice in, until they decided that instead of doing this on the day shift, we would be pulled from night shift to work a day shift to qualify and to then double back to midnights again. Just what you needed. Break up what little sleep pattern you had. The excuses was always the same. We're shorthanded. They used to tell us they were shorthanded all the time, right up until the point where there was something like 300 agents on a shift, and they were still saying, oh, we're shorthanded. I heard that same story for 26 and a half years. We don't have enough vehicles. We don't have enough manpower. We don't have enough bullets. It was always we were shorthanded, short of something. We had one restaurant on the south side of town, and they closed at 9 p.m. If you needed food or a cup of coffee, well, a cup of hot black water, we had to drive into the North Territory. You had to go to Denny's or Juleps. They sat right across the street from each other. The parking lots almost always had Border Patrol units in them, especially on midnights. Well, most restaurants liked having people in uniform with guns in the restaurant at night to keep the nasty folks away. Laredo had more than our share of nasty folks because San Antonio put them all on buses and sent them south to us. So we had some really colorful folks. We had a guy, we called him Elvis, because that's what we called him. He used the black shoe polish to make his gray hair look black, and it just kind of stuck out in every direction. He had an equal number of teeth on the top and the bottom, 5 on the right upper side and 5 on the left lower side. I think he was just this side of being absolutely crazy. His idea of a bath was taking all of his clothes off and climbing into the fountain in front of the Laredo Bank. I've seen way too much of this guy on occasion. He was a constant pest, but he never spent more than one night in jail at a time. Well, one night while at Denny's with a couple of new guys, I saw Elvis sitting at the counter. He was trying to talk to the waitress anytime she walked by him. At the time, I used to lift weights and run marathons, so I was in pretty good physical shape. Well, Elvis grabbed the waitress. And I said, okay, that's enough. And I went over and I grabbed Elvis. I grabbed him by the collar and the belt, and I lifted him off of his chair. I carried him out into the parking lot, and I told him to go away. Okay, that's not really what I said, but that's pretty much what I told him. Well, of course, he was not happy, and he yelled and screamed he was going to sue me. And I told him I was going to put him in jail for assaulting the waitress. And I'm sure she would have backed me up on that one because the waitresses kind of liked us. So he left. I went back to the table and I told the new guys, do not do what I just did until you got at least 10 years in. I think I had 5 at the time. Sometimes we would find ourselves in situations where we had to step outside of our duties. I was once more working with a new guy, and we were in the River Drive Mall parking lot when a small riot broke out. High school kids from Martin and Nixon were coming back home the night of the prom. and they ran into each other in the parking lot. Two guys who were thoroughly drunk were trying to fight. They apparently learned how to fight from watching TV, but they were trying, and everybody was standing around, kind of egging them on, and it looked like the fight was going to spread. So I drove right into the middle, honking the horn and blowing the siren. Then I got out and I stepped in between these two guys. But I didn't tell them they were going to jail. I told everybody else they were going to jail unless they took these two nincompoops home. Well, the semi-sober students grabbed these two and hauled them over and put them in a couple of cars and drove off. Then I went and I told my partner, don't you ever do what I just did until you got at least 10 years in. Broke up a small riot. Nobody got hurt. Nobody had to go to the hospital. Probably one of the stupider things I did. No, that's not but it wasn't the smartest thing I ever did. Scott, if you ever hear this show, remember, never go into the river. It's not worth it. That didn't happen on midnight, so I'm not going to talk about it. It's just not worth it. Bars in Texas close at 2 a.m. This is how it's been since I can remember. If you're working upriver, which was also the downtown area, there was a game that we liked to play with the bars in town. As folks were staggering out the doors looking for their cars, we would slowly drive up to the front door and stop. A lot of these drunks would see us and they'd turn around, walk back into the bar because they were not here legally. These folks didn't realize that Sector had told us, do not pick up drunks because we can't prove they're illegally here. But we would drive around the block like sharks circling a sinking ship and try to get to the front door about the same time the same group of people were coming out. You had these women in what we call chorizo dresses. A chorizo dress is a spandex outfit that is way too tight for the person in it. If they were to sneeze or cough, the dress would probably pop right off. So we would go around the block and try to keep these people inside the bar for as long as we could. Just a little something to break up the evening. Well, one night as we were pulling into Jarvis Plaza, was it? I think it was Jarvis Plaza. The bar right in front of us, the doors flew open and everybody came running out. They weren't looking at us, though. They were looking over their shoulders at something that must have just happened inside. And then PD showed up, the police department. They came flying into the plaza, and men were jumping out of their cars with their guns in their hands. So we figured we'd better stick around and see what's going on because we weren't that smart. Well, it turned out that a guy on the dance floor, somebody had bumped into him and he had shot that person. It was one of those butt bumps that, well, in a crowded bar, it happens, but I guess he didn't like it. So he just goes ahead and shoots this guy. The police were interviewing everybody in the building. About 100 people said they were all in the bathroom at the time the shooting took place, and the others all swore they were out in the parking lot. Apparently, the dance floor was completely empty when this guy shot the other guy. That's what their story was, anyway. This guy was walking down the street still holding the gun, and that's how the police caught him. We were driving around downtown another night, and we spotted this little old man walking along. He was about 5 to 5'2" tall, and he didn't weigh 100 pounds. He was in his best cowboy outfit. He was walking along using a rather corpulent young lady to hold himself up. She had on all the trappings of a woman of negotiable affections. He was running his hands over his body. She was pretending like she didn't like it, while at the same time laughing and kind of encouraging him. We drove by and we looked at this couple and we determined they were too drunk to be illegal aliens. That should be a place on the 213. Too drunk to be illegal. So we just kept on driving. Went looking for some less drunk aliens to talk to. Well, about an hour later, we're driving down the same street and we see the same old man walking along, but now he's with a different young lady who was also rather large. And he was running his hands all over her body like that was the thing to do in public. We drove by and thought, well, okay, the guy likes large women, and but then me being me, I said, "You ever heard of Albert Fish? Or how about Ed Gein?" And my partner was like, "No." So I told him about it. Both of these men had been cannibals. Jeffrey Dahmer hadn't happened yet. So we got to laughing about this old guy taking these large women home for dinner. Of course, then we got to thinking, crazy things like that do happen. Maybe we should go back and look around, but we never did find him or any signs that anything bad happened to these young ladies. But it's funny how your brain works on midnight. I still to this day wonder what happened to those women. We had a place we called the Love Shack. Yes, from the song. It was its unofficial name, but everybody knew what you were talking about if you said that. It was a pink house in the D1 neighborhood across I-35 from the downtown. A lot of drunks would have to cross the road right in front of Bridge 2 in order to get from the downtown to the D1. But at night, Bridge 2 would close, so there wasn't any traffic. We kind of sort of knew most of the girls, the women, all the people that worked out of the Love Shack. Uh, didn't know them personally, but you knew them by sight because they were constantly involved in illegal activities. The house had been raided at least a dozen times that I could think of for drugs and illegal aliens and things like that. Mary was the owner. She was covered from head to foot with tattoos, and not the good looking tattoos, but the kind you get when you spend a lot of time in jail. She was constantly losing weight, never gaining anything back. We think she must have had some kind of a disease that would cause you to keep losing weight, but don't know for sure. She also had track marks up both arms, lots of track marks. It takes about 100 hits of heroin to cause a 1-inch track, so she was a constant user. Her sister, younger sister, liked to dress up like a runner, with the runner's outfit, except she wore cowboy boots instead of running shoes. And she was also covered with tattoos, except she had them on her face as well. And once again, these were not the kind of tattoos you would get at Por Vida Tattoo Shop. These were the kind you would get in the the Crowbar Hotel or the Greystone University. There was a rather large blonde woman. Then there was this Hispanic girl who liked to run around the neighborhood with nothing on but her underthings. The police would stop by and they'd tell her to put her clothes back on, and she would, but as soon as the cops were gone, she would take her clothes off again and walk around like that. She was a bit large as well. And then there was this one fairly good looking person who hung out at the Love Shack. He was, he liked to dress like a woman. We knew it was a he because I'd seen his driver's license. But, well, it was, that was the gang. It was about 5, sometimes 6 folks at the Love Shack. On really snow lights, okay, that didn't make any sense. On really slow nights, we had a game that we would play. You would pick a street downtown, and then you would try to drive the entire length of the street without having to stop at a red light. Now, all the streets in downtown are one ways, uh, so you learned which streets went left, which went right. Because every once in a while you'd have 2 streets side by side, both going the wrong direction. So you'd try to drive from one end of the street to the other without having to stop at a red light. You could not speed up if the light was turning yellow. That was breaking the rules. Of course, there's nobody around to enforce the rules, but that's what we would do. If you made it all the way to the end of the street without having to stop, you would key the mic and you would simply say, "I did it." And everybody knew what you're talking about. At least everybody at our station. And then you'd go and find another street and try to do it again. All you got for your effort was bragging rights, but hey, midnights, you took what you could. The gravel pit was located just south of LCC. Well, it started out as LJC, and then it became LCC, and then it's just LC, or Laredo College. A company had built a business selling gravel many years ago, and everybody was surprised when they discovered that the land they were selling actually belonged to the city. And the company was not splitting any of the profits with the city, and so they were closed. They went out of business, but they left everything behind. All their equipment, they had roads to the trees. So now you had this great big area that we call the gravel pit. The trick to do, listen to Coast or read a scary book all night, and then get out of your vehicle and walk through the gravel pit if you're manly enough. And that was one of our games that we played. There was a very good chance that you might run into something scary, but that's what we would do to stay awake. Several other folks would do this as well, and we would compare notes. One agent was telling me that he was walking along the trail and he came to where these 2 buses were driven off into the brush. Just a couple of tour buses that don't know how they wound up down there. PD said they weren't stolen. Well, he was walking by these 2 buses when somebody grabbed him by the shoulder. Of course, he immediately spun around with his pistol. There was nobody there. It was not uncommon to hear voices around these buses, and then you search all around and not find anyone. You look at the ground and there were no footprints. And yet, there was some really weird things going on around those buses. Also, another agent was telling me before he had joined the Border Patrol, he had run into that group of Satanists in the gravel pit, the same ones that I had run into down at One River Place. The Satanists hung out in various unusual locations. There was an old tennis court on the south side of the college that they liked to use as well. It was a tennis court, but it didn't have a net in the middle. It was just the pavement with a fence around the edge. Uh, been doing this show for 575 episodes now. So every once in a while, I'll wind up mentioning something I've already talked about. And also, I got to talk to Art Bell about my encounter with the Satanists. And yeah, that was on Midnights as well. Agents walking through the gravel pit have also run into a woman with a long black dress. Her hair hangs way down past her waist, and when she moves, she's usually about a foot off the ground. She just glides along through the trees, following the riverbank, heading to who knows where. She's been seen in the gravel pit, at LC, and near the water plant. That's her stomping grounds, except she doesn't stomp, she glides. That's how we would spend part of our shift on occasion. Down south is a road that the city workers had built long ago. The mayor owned the property and he had the city workers take city equipment and city money and pave his ranch so that he could create a high-end housing complex right on the river. Well, when the mayor wound up getting arrested, the project kind of fell by the wayside. His lawyer determined that the mayor was too old and too sick to have to go to jail, so instead he spent his weekends in the hospital. He had a private hospital room that was nicer than most hotel rooms. Big bed, big TV, all the comforts of home in a hospital. Yes, I've seen the room. It was impressive. Well, anyway, getting back to that to that high-end neighborhood he was building, the aliens liked to use it because you could land right there, jump in a car, and be driven out of the neighborhood quickly on one of the paved roads. We liked it as well because you could sneak into that neighborhood, and there were all kinds of places where you could hide to catch the bad people. That's where I met the Satanists. Well, also, young kids would go down to this neighborhood and park and do things that they weren't supposed to do. High school kids and such. Well, one night, this young lady was with her boyfriend, who was also a drug smuggler, and she had taken some drugs and apparently passed out. So this young man with no morals and no scruples decided that that meant he could have his way with her, which he did. Well, she came to and decided that she was not happy with what he was doing, so she started to scream and punch him. So he decided to make her relax a bit by smacking her in the head with a tire iron. Well, she relaxed a whole lot and stopped breathing. So he drove down to One River Place, yanked her body out of the back seat, and left her laying on the side of the road and drove away. Well, there's a little memorial set on the side of the road right where her body had been found. I would drive down there on midnights, anytime on midnights, with my camera, and I would click pictures from every angle. I'd move around, I'd take photographs, and then I would ask questions. I would use a small tape recorder. Well, at the time, small tape recorder, and I would, do all the paranormal stuff you see on TV. Is there anybody here that would like to speak to me? That kind of thing. And then I would sit there and I'd listen to the tapes and I'd look at the the photographs. I never caught any indication that her spirit was still hanging around there, but it might be. If you drive down to One River Place, there should still be a little marker on the right-hand side. Midnight, some folks found it was just way too hard to stay awake. Once all the activity had died down and the radio had gotten quiet, some agents would find a nice quiet spot where they could park and hopefully not be discovered. Now, some of the less intelligent ones had this crazy idea of stretching out on the back seat of their unit, only to discover that the back doors in our vehicles wouldn't open from the inside. The door handles were disconnected because that's where the bad people rode, and you didn't want them just jumping out anytime they wanted to. So now this agent would discover that he is now locked in the back seat of his unit. So he would call on the radio for somebody to come please help him. Of course, that's not what he'd say on the radio. He would call around and, hey, are you anywhere in this neighborhood? Hey, would you meet me over here? If I had to show up, I would show up with my camera and click a picture of the guy locked in the back seat so I would have evidence of what happened. It's always a good idea to carry a camera with you at all times. If your partner should happen to fall asleep, you get a picture of it and you squirrel it away for future reference in case this guy ever becomes, say, a supervisor with a big head. It's amazing how fast a person will deflate when shown evidence of their own misdeeds. Uh, I'm not the only one that did that, and several people did have a comeuppance as a result of their big-headed attitudes. Several of my trainees over the years did become supervisors. The last duty station that I worked at, the PAIC had been one of my trainees. So that's why I always say treat your trainees well. You never know where these people are going to go. It was not blackmail, it was insurance. Just for those of y'all that might be wondering why I never became a supervisor, it's because my mother and father were married when I was born. Anybody that was in the military will probably recognize that saying. Really, though, the best position to hold in the Border Patrol was as an 11. A GS 11 was our pay grade. Later, it became GS 12 because of some kind of malarkey out of Washington, but all that did was confuse people. A GS 9 was an agent. An 11 was a senior agent, and a 12 was a supervisor. As an 11, you were allowed to do things that the 9s couldn't do. But at the same time, you didn't have the responsibilities of being a 12. It was kind of like being a warrant officer, kind of, sort of, but not really. It was the best position to have. Plus, if a supervisor was needed in another part of the sector, the chief would simply say, you are now assigned to that station, and you couldn't argue about it. As an 11, you stayed at the station that you stayed at. Well, that was how things were done. Now, getting back to the finding that secret parking spot. Around 3 or 4 a.m., those of us who drank lots of coffee and listened to Art Bell would go hunting. We knew the odds of catching aliens were pretty small because most of the aliens, they crossed earlier in the shift or later in the shift, but not 3 or 4 in the morning. No, what we were hunting were other agents looking to have a little fun at their mistakes. If you spotted a vehicle parked in some isolated spot and you didn't want to, or you already had enough photographs, what you would do is you would slip into stealth mode. We had a button under the dash that you'd flip the button and all the lights in the vehicle would go out. No brake lights, no reverse lights. Then you'd line up your vehicle with their vehicle just right and you'd drive into the back bumper. Not hard enough to cause any damage to the vehicle, but enough to shake whoever was asleep inside. Talk about scaring the heck out of a person. You had to be careful, though. Lots of swearing would happen after you'd done this. Of course, I never did anything like that because it would have been wrong. Funny, but wrong. If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell. There were some agents that you knew that you did not mess with. One of these agents was named Mongo. Yes, he looked like Alex Karras, just not quite as tall. Mongo was dangerous, even when he was asleep. Now, what he would do is he would park somewhere and then he would sit there and act like he was asleep, waiting for somebody to come along and try to mess with him so he could mess with them back. He was good at setting traps for people. He was a good guy to work with because, well, he was a good dude as long as he liked you. If he didn't like you, you didn't want any part of him. Well, we had this one Ford van. It was considered to be cursed. It spent more time in the shop than it spent on the line. The engine would go out, it would have to go to sector, it'd sit there for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months, waiting for parts, waiting for somebody to fix it. Then it would come back on the line, it would be on the line a week or two, and then it was back in the shop. Now, we were told in order to get rid of this vehicle, it had to have 75,000 miles, at least. That was the magic number to rotate a vehicle off of the line, which is funny because we had a couple of vehicles that had 200,000 miles on them. So much for the 75,000 mark. Well, on midnights, a couple of agents would get assigned to take this Ford van and drive it. Drive it down to Zapata and back. The idea was to get to Zapata and back as fast as you could, hoping that you didn't break down on the side of the road. Put as many miles on this thing as you could, then beat feet back to the office where you'd be given a decent vehicle to drive the rest of the shift. I spent many a interesting night sitting on the passenger seat clutching the dashboard as my journeyman tried to get to Zapata and back in 30 minutes. It's a 60-mile drive one way. Ooh. Yes, many a shift was spent that way, on midnights. Midnights can be exciting. It can be interesting. Or it can be so god awful boring that you almost cry about it. When things do happen, it can be terrifying, but that's very few, very seldom, just something to not look forward to. Quiet is good unless you're a type A personality. The type B personalities, well, they're pretty much quiet all the time, so it's hard to tell if they're even breathing or not. For any of you out there that are still working midnight shift, stay safe, stay sane, and don't get caught doing anything that you're going to have to explain to the chief about. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, Spread it around to tell other folks that they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Until next time, see ya.
Are you coming to the tree where there strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.